Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of my introductory set of podcasts in my Dare to Speak Difficult Conversations Can Change Everything podcast series. Why difficult conversations are so hard to tackle has its roots in childhood, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. When we are young, we experience the world very, very differently from the way we are as adults. And, there's it's almost like a joke, I think, in psychotherapy or psychiatry of going, tell me about your childhood. And it can feel at times a little irrelevant to go back to our childhood because we can think, yeah, but why does that matter? The problem that I've got is in the here and now. But the reason why it does matter to talk about childhood is because the roots of our early experiences that teach us what we can and can't do in the world often have happened in our childhood. And we're living in a time now, and you will perhaps recognize this if you have children or you're involved in children, that the way we interact with children, the way we teach children, even the extent to which we give children iPads and phones from a very young age, is very, very different from what you would have experienced when you were younger. I know certainly that nobody would have given me an electronic item that cost £1,000 when I was 7 and said, "Here you are, you can have access to the world through this." I know there's a part of me that secretly wishes that I had had that, but that is not how it happened. If we were given anything even remotely valuable to hold when we were young, parents would hover around and tell us to be careful and not break it and not damage it. But now this is something that we regularly do. And I'm using that as an illustration of how differently we raise our kids from how we were raised. Schools are not perfect at this, but certainly schools and organisations now have vision and values. They may not be very good at dealing with it, but there is an understanding that there is well-being, that there is mental health, that is a factor in people's lives, that talking about things does matter. This is something that is certainly communicated a lot in media, in social media, in organisations. We take care of our staff, we care about people, that kind of thing. But the reality is we're playing catch up in the world at the moment. When I was young, children were meant to be dutiful, meant to be obedient, meant to be helpful. There was no question when I was young about writing thank you cards, for example, at Christmas or for birthdays. Now, kids can jump on a FaceTime. They can send a text, a voice note, an email, or perhaps as parents, we don't want to force them into the painful handwriting of thank you cards that we experienced when we were younger. So there's a difference between how we're raising our children now than how we were raised very, very often. And that's a good thing. I know I speak with some people and they say, well, it was good enough for me and it's good enough for my child. And I'm not sure if I fully agree with that, but I can understand where that comes from too as a way of approaching this. But the roots of silence, generally speaking, do come from childhood. And that does not mean that of somebody who had abusive or bad parents. Partly it's cultural. Again, when I was young, and perhaps when you were young, we were taught that we should respect our elders, that we shouldn't answer back, we shouldn't talk back, that we should be respectful, we should listen to what people who were older than us had to say. That's what we were taught. And in that comes the roots of conflict. What if there is a parent and they're doing something that you don't agree with? There was another saying in childhood, maybe you're familiar with this: do as I say, not as I do. Now, when you're an adult, you can understand that. You can say, oh, okay, there's an inconsistency there. Maybe you can deal with it. But when you're a child, that's very, very confusing. Because what does it really mean? Do as I say, but not as I do. Does it mean that I'm meant to ignore bad behavior or I'm meant to allow for it? Does it mean that when I grow up, I'll be able to do bad behavior? What does it mean? Because children don't have experience. They don't have the kind of perspective that we might have as adults. So what that means is a child, your children, children you know, you as a child, can be in a situation where you're going to try and say something to an adult. I don't understand that. Why is it okay for you to do that, but it's not okay for me to do that? And that child can be at a massive disadvantage in the power dynamic within a relationship. They're at a disadvantage in terms of knowledge because they're young and they've got less experience, and the adult's older and got more experience. They're at a disadvantage within that societal idea that somehow adults know what they're talking about. And they're at a disadvantage because a child's ability to act in the world, to have control of their own lives, is much, much less than the adult's ability to act in the child's life and have control of the child's world. So when we are teaching our children to express themselves, understanding that the child might be too much, might be too loud, might say things that make us uncomfortable, it's certainly something I experience with my own children. When I decided that I would allow them to speak about what they were concerned about or what they were worried about or what they didn't like about my behaviour, man, that was confronting. Because I'd opened the possibility for them to tell me that I was being difficult, I was being the problem, I was being emotionally deregulated. And that really hit me because I'm like, oh my gosh, well, first of all, they're right. But I would never have spoken to my parents that way because I would have been punished for it. And I would have been shut down really firmly. So the roots of silence in you, in me, will often stem from the fact that as children, we were in this unequal parent-child dynamic. And it needs to be unequal to some extent. I'm not criticizing that. But what I'm doing is calling our attention to it because it's easy to overlook that. It is easy to overlook that when a child comes to us and says, I've got a problem or I'm not happy, where we are in that moment, whether we're distracted, whether we're irritated, whether we're under stress, whether we're in a pressurized situation, will inform how we respond to that child. And the way that we respond to that child may, not necessarily, lead the child to decide that even though we've said that we should bring our problems, we don't really mean it. And that goes back to do as I say, not as I do. The child has to navigate because children are heavily reliant on their parents. So the roots of difficult conversations, the roots of our fear of conflict may come from that. They may also come from how our parents, how our family, sometimes a wider family, and it's not always parents, it could be grandparents, it could be carers, it depends how you were raised. But it depends how the people around you dealt with conflict. A stoic, stiff upper lip attitude, for example, that says, well, just, eat cake and get on with it kind of thing, keep calm and carry on, might teach us that the right thing to do is just persevere or try harder. The lessons that we learn in childhood are complicated, and they kind of land a bit like seeds. If you throw a pile of seeds out into the garden, you never quite know which ones are going to grow, which ones are going to land. And that's because we are all really different. Some of us are introvert, some of us are extrovert, some of us are optimistic, some of us are more pessimistic, some of us are naturally more cautious and anxious about things. Some of us are more sensitive, and that's a good thing. Some of us are more aware of other people. We have a bigger empathic drive within us. Some are less empathic. Some are visual. Some are auditory. Some are olfactory. We're kind of led by our smells. Some of us struggle with really what might seem immaterial to somebody else. You know, one person really, really, really doesn't like the sensation of mushrooms when they're cooked. They never really learn about whether they like the taste or not. The sensation of it's like, oh my God, I don't like that. Some of us are really bothered by labels. We're like, oh man, that label, it's really itching, it's really itching. And so that's really, really distracting. We understand it with, I don't know, if I use the example of dogs, that we understand that dogs are all different breeds and they, you know, one dog really likes chasing balls and the other one's used for herding and another dog not interested whatsoever. You know, you've got a beagle and all they really care about is sniffing stuff. They don't really care about anything else, except the occasional beagle that does. And guess what? They like chasing balls. Who knew where that came from? So there's a massive amount of variation between children. There's a massive amount of variation between all humans, even humans within the same family. You can have one who is more sensitive to noise and one who is less sensitive to noise. And when we're looking at children and we are valuing them as being individuals, but at the same time, we're not necessarily looking at them in terms of, well, what are their characteristics? What can and can't they cope with? Then what happens is when they try and speak about something that matters to them, the child may experience shutdown. And if they come from a family which deals with conflict or differences of opinion, by shutting down the conversation or by becoming volatile or inflammatory or by being confusing for the child. An example of this would be offering a child choice and feeling like that's a good thing to do because you never got any choices when you were a child, but not necessarily teaching the child how to make choices and how to deal with the consequence of those choices. So, for example, we would know that sometimes you can make a choice and it seems like the right thing to do in the short term, but in the longer term, it was not such a great choice to make. How we teach a child choices about how they speak or how they deal with things is going to affect their behavior and then is going to affect the kind of problems that they exhibit and experience. And if they say to their parent, I've got a real problem with this, and you say, well, you shouldn't have done it, I told you not to, then it's likely that that child's going to experience that as a shutdown and feel perhaps ashamed, perhaps embarrassed, perhaps foolish. And that may then become a difficult conversation. Now, when I'm saying this, I am understanding that being a parent is really, really difficult. Dealing with children is really, really difficult. Dealing with other people can be really, really difficult. I know that. And I definitely understand that. But in the world of difficult conversations, in this podcast, which is Dare to Speak, difficult conversations that can change everything or anything, that can open your life and help you to grow, understanding that the complexity and the vagaries of what happened to us in our childhood do have an impact on how we approach these things in adulthood. We're going to make mistakes. We have to make mistakes. We definitely do. I have made so many mistakes. I make them to this day. I know all of this stuff. I've written a book. I teach on this. I talk on this. I work in this. I've done it for 25 years. I study this with immense commitment, but I still make mistakes because the reality in navigating these conversations in day-to-day life is hard. So I'm not saying that we want to expect to get it right. We're not going to get it right. But one of the key facts is understanding that we get it wrong. And when we do get it wrong, we might feel guilty, we might feel ashamed, we might feel really bad. But here's the thing about failure. Failure is feedback. And when we know that we're getting it wrong, or we're aware that we're getting it wrong, and we can have that difficult conversation with ourselves and say, man, I screwed up there. I really, really should have, I wish I'd done that differently. then we're in a position that we can start to grow and say, right, well, what can I do differently? How can I go back into that conversation and say to that child again, "Mm, I think maybe I shut you down and maybe you had something important to say. I'd like to let you know that I am ready to listen now I've reflected." How can we say to the child, "You know, I asked for that feedback, then I really didn't like the feedback that you gave me. So actually, can I ask again? I'm sorry I reacted that way. Actually, what I need to do is listen and understand because if my behavior is affecting you, I need to know why." Or being able to go to the child and say, "I think I've told you to make better choices, but maybe I haven't explained fully how you select a better choice or how you deal with it when I look like I'm upset with the choice that you've made because you need to learn." Or something that really came up with my kids, they wanted a lot more independence, and I realized that my reluctance to give them independence was because I was scared of what would happen. But actually, they were really confident. They had been raised well. They knew how to navigate going on the buses or whatever it was. And that my fear was coming across to them like I didn't trust them. And of course, I do want my children both to trust, to know that I trust them, but also I want them to trust themselves. I can't cover all of this in one podcast episode, and I will be talking about this over the course of the coming weeks and months again and again, because the roots of the silence, understanding it in ourselves and in our children and the people around us is really, really important. It's not something you can do in one short episode, but it is something to just leave you thinking, gosh, where was I silenced? Where am I silencing others? This is not about judgment. We're all doing it. I do it. This is about beginning to get curious, beginning to ask the question, beginning to reflect, beginning to understand that learning how to speak, daring to speak, navigating difficult conversations, not being able to do it or not feeling confident is not a failure. It's just a set of skills that we are going to learn together. So thank you for joining me today. We will be coming back to this topic again and again. And I look forward to seeing you in the next episode where we will dive a little more deeper into this. If anything here today resonated with you, perhaps take it to your journal, write it down. Do feel free to share it with me in the comments or send me an email. Go to my website. The details are in the show notes. Send me an email about how this hit with you, and that will help me form those next episodes where we dive deeper and deeper into this subject because it's worth a deep dive. It really is. So thank you for your time today. See you next time.